The morning fog still clung to the Douglas firs when Detective Sarah Chen's phone buzzed against the nightstand, pulling her from a dream about her daughter's laugh. The digital clock glowed 5:47 a.m., and the caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in months, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. "Chen here," she answered, her voice rough with sleep and the remnants of too many cigarettes she'd quit 5 years ago, but still craved when cases kept her awake. "Sarah, it's Dr. Martinez from the lab. We got a hit on that DNA sample you've been pushing through the system, the Riverside Elementary case from '98. The words hit her like ice wire. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Riverside Elementary case. 26 years of dead ends, false leads, and a community that had never quite healed from the wound of losing 8-year-old Emma Lawson on a Tuesday morning in October, her small body found 3 days later in the woods behind the school playground, where she used to count ladybugs on the monkey bars. "You sure about this?" Sarah's feet found the cold hardwood floor, and she was already reaching for the jeans she draped over her bedroom chair. Through her window, she could see the lights beginning to flicker on in the houses across Maple Street, the same street where Emma Lawson had lived with her parents in a yellow house with white shutters and a garden full of sunflowers that her mother, Rebecca, had planted the spring before she died. "Positive match. CODIS database flagged it at 11:34 p.m. last night. Sarah," Dr. Martinez's voice carried a weight that made her pause in pulling on her sweater. "The suspect is local. Has been this whole time." The drive to the station took 12 minutes through the awakening streets of Cascade Falls, Washington, a town of 14,000 people nestled between the Cascade Mountains and the Columbia River, where everyone knew everyone else's business and secrets were currency traded over coffee at Millie's Diner and whispered in the aisles of Peterson's Grocery. Sarah had grown up here, left for college and the police academy in Seattle, and returned 8 years ago when her marriage fell apart, and she needed the kind of healing that only familiar mountains and childhood memories could provide. The Riverside Elementary case had been her obsession since day one on the job. The previous detective, Bill Hawthorne, had handed her a box of files on his retirement, his weathered hand shaking slightly as he passed her the manila folders that contained 26 years of frustration. "This one will eat you," he'd warned, his gray eyes holding the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying unsolved mysteries. Emma Lawson deserved better than what this town gave her. Her family deserved answers. Now, walking into the fluorescent-lit bullpen of the Cascade Falls Police Department, Sarah felt the weight of those words settling around her like a familiar coat. Detective Mike Rodriguez was already at his desk, 2 steaming cups of coffee waiting, his dark eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses that made him look younger than his 42 years. "Martinez called me after she talked to you. Figured he'd want backup when you hear the name." Sarah's hand stilled halfway to the coffee. "It's someone I know." "Someone we all know." Mike's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "It's Janet Morrison." The coffee cup slipped from Sarah's hands, hitting the desk with a sharp crack that sent hot liquid spreading across reports and photographs. Janet Morrison, the woman who organized search parties for Emma Lawson, who had stood at the podium during town hall meetings demanding more resources for the investigation, who had hugged Rebecca Lawson at Emma's funeral and promised her that justice would come. Janet Morrison, who ran the town's only bookstore and read stories to children every Thursday afternoon, her gentle voice bringing characters to life in the same community center where Emma's memorial service had been held. "That's not possible," Sarah whispered, but even as she spoke, fragments of memory began shifting and rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle she'd been staring at for years without seeing the complete picture. Janet Morrison, who knew Emma's routines. Janet Morrison, who had access to the school as a volunteer reading tutor. Janet Morrison, who was one of the last people to see Emma alive on that October morning, walking the girl to her classroom because she had been running late and had forgotten her backpack in the bookstore where her mother had taken her the evening before to pick out a new chapter book. Mike pulled up the digital case file on his computer, the screen filling with photographs and reports that Sarah had memorized down to the smallest detail. Emma's school photo, her gap-toothed smile bright against the standard blue background. The crime scene photos from the woods, carefully cataloged evidence markers standing like tiny monuments in the fallen leaves, the timeline that had never quite made sense, with a 47-minute gap between when Emma was last seen at school and when her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had called her mother to ask why Emma hadn't returned from lunch. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The DNA came from skin cells under Emma's fingernails, Mike continued, his voice professional but strained. The sample was too degraded for analysis in '98, but the new techniques... He trailed off, both of them understanding the bitter irony, technology that could have saved a community decades of anguish, arriving just late enough to feel like a cruel joke. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Chief Morrison, no relation to Janet, despite the shared name, that had caused confusion for years in a town where coincidences felt significant and surnames carried the weight of generations. The message was brief. Arrest warrant approved. Judge Hendricks signed off at 6:15 a.m. Bring her in, quiet. Quiet. In a town like Cascade Falls, where news traveled faster than forest fire smoke and secrets had a half-life measured in minutes, quiet was an impossibility. Already, Sarah could imagine the ripple effects spreading outward from this moment like stones thrown into still water. The morning shift at the diner would buzz with speculation. The early commuters grabbing coffee at the gas station would carry fragments of rumor to their jobs in the county seat. By noon, the story would have reached every corner of the community that had spent 26 years wondering who among them was capable of taking a child. "How do we do this?" Mike asked, voicing the question that had been forming in Sarah's mind. Janet Morrison wasn't just a suspect, she was a pillar of the community, a woman whose bookstore had been a gathering place for grief and healing after Emma's death. She had organized fundraisers for the Lawson family, had lobbied the city council for better playground lighting, had been the public face of a town's determination to never forget. Sarah reached for her jacket, her mind already working through the logistics. "We go to the store first. She opens at 7:30, always has. We talk to her before anyone else knows what's happening." She paused, looking at the coffee stains spreading across her desk, the dark liquid seeping into reports she'd read hundreds of times. "And we pray she doesn't run." The bookstore sat on Main Street between the hardware store and the pharmacy, its green-painted exterior cheerful even in the gray morning light. Through the large front windows, Sarah could see Janet Morrison moving between the shelves, her silver hair caught in a neat bun, her movements deliberate and unhurried as she prepared for another day of selling stories to a community that had become part of her own narrative in ways no one had imagined. A small brass bell announced their entry, its cheerful chime incongruous with the weight of what they carried. Janet looked up from behind the counter, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a smile beginning to form before she registered the expressions on their faces. Sarah watched the moment of recognition, saw the subtle shift in Janet's posture, the way her hands stilled on the book she'd been sorting. "Detective Chen," Janet said, her voice carrying the same warmth that it held during 26 years of community meetings and chance encounters at the grocery store. "You're here early. Is everything all right?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities, and weighted with the knowledge that nothing would ever be all right again, not for Janet Morrison, not for the community that had trusted her, not for the memory of a little girl who had loved books and ladybugs and had died because someone she trusted had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Sarah's hand moved to her badge, the metal cool against her palm, and she felt the weight of 26 years of questions finally finding their answers. Sarah's morning routine had been the same for 8 years. Wake at 5:30, coffee black and strong, 20 minutes on the stationary bike in her spare bedroom while CNN played on the old television she'd inherited from her grandmother. The predictability of it had been her anchor after the divorce, after moving back to Cascade Falls with nothing but 2 suitcases and a determination to rebuild herself in the place where she'd first learned what it meant to belong somewhere. But this morning was different. The stationary bike sat unused, and the coffee had grown cold as she stood in her kitchen, staring out at the maple tree in her backyard where a rope swing still hung from the branch her father had chosen when she was 7 years old. The swing moved slightly in the morning breeze, and Sarah found herself remembering Emma Lawson's mother pushing her daughter on the playground swings, both of them laughing as Emma's brown hair caught the sunlight. The memory felt different now, poisoned by the knowledge of what had come after, by the understanding that someone had been watching those moments of joy and planning to end them. Sarah had joined the police force because she believed in order, and the possibility that chaos could be contained and justice could prevail if you were willing to work hard enough and care deeply enough. Her academy instructors had praised her attention to detail, her ability to see patterns others missed, her stubborn refusal to give up on cases that others considered cold. But none of that training had prepared her for the sick feeling in her stomach as she drove through the familiar streets of her hometown, knowing that she was about to arrest someone who had been part of the community's healing process, someone who had offered comfort to the very people whose lives she had destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sarah had spent countless hours in Morrison's books over the years, browsing the mystery section, chatting with Janet about the latest Louise Penny novel, or debating the merits of Nordic noir versus cozy British mysteries. Janet had recommended books to her, had listened to her complain about difficult cases, had even offered her store as a meeting place when Sarah had organized a neighborhood watch group 3 years ago after a series of break-ins near the elementary school. "You have good instincts," Janet had told her during one of those conversations, her fingers tracing the spine of a well-worn Agatha Christie novel. "You see things others miss. This town is lucky to have you." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she parked outside the police station, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Good instincts. She'd missed the most important thing of all, had sat across from a child killer and discussed the art of detection without ever detecting the monster hiding behind gentle smiles and community service. Detective Rodriguez was waiting in the station lobby, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his tie askew in a way that suggested he'd dressed quickly after a sleepless night. Mike had been her partner for 3 years, and she'd learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, the way he adjusted his glasses when he was thinking through a problem, the slight tightening around his eyes when a case bothered him more than usual, the careful way he chose his words when he was trying to protect someone from a painful truth. "The warrant's ready," he said without preamble, holding up the folded papers. "Judge Hendricks wanted to make sure we had everything in order. Said this is going to be the biggest thing to hit this town since the mill fire in '89. Sarah nodded, accepting the weight of the documents. The mill fire had been an accident, a tragedy that brought the community together in shared loss and mutual support. This was different. This was betrayal on a scale that would leave scars for generations. "Her store doesn't open for another hour," Sarah said, checking her watch. "We could wait, catch her when she's alone, minimize the spectacle. Or we could go to her house," Mike suggested. "Get this over with before the morning shift starts at the diner, before the rumors start flying." Janet Morrison lived on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the elementary school, in a 2-story craftsman house painted the color of butter, with window boxes full of herbs and a front porch lined with hanging baskets of fuchsias that she tended every evening after closing the store. Sarah had always admired the garden during her evening runs, had sometimes caught glimpses of Janet reading on her porch swing, her cat curled beside her as the sun set behind the mountains. The normalcy of it felt obscene now. How many evenings had Janet Morrison sat on that porch surrounded by beauty she had cultivated with her own hands, while Emma Lawson's parents grieved for their daughter? How many times had she watered those flowers, tended those herbs, created life and beauty while carrying the knowledge of the life she had destroyed? "She'll ask for a lawyer," Mike said as they drove through the quiet residential streets, past houses where families were beginning their morning routines, unaware that their world was about to shift on its axis. "Smart woman like that, she'll know her rights." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, but something in her gut suggested otherwise. In her experience, criminals fell into 2 categories when finally confronted: those who immediately lawyered up and those who couldn't help themselves from talking, driven by guilt or arrogance or simple human need to be understood. She had a feeling Janet Morrison would want to explain herself, would need to justify 26 years of deception. They parked across the street from the butter-colored house, and Sarah found herself studying the details she'd never noticed during her evening runs. The brass numbers beside the front door were polished to a shine. The morning newspaper still lay on the front walk, folded neatly and protected by a plastic sleeve. A coffee cup sat on the porch railing, steam still rising from its surface, suggesting that Janet was awake and following her own morning routine, unaware that this would be the last normal morning she would ever have. "You ready for this?" Mike asked, his hand on the door handle. Sarah thought about Emma Lawson's parents, who had divorced 2 years after their daughter's death, unable to bear the weight of shared grief. She thought about Rebecca Lawson, who had moved away from Cascade Falls and died in a car accident 5 years later. Some people said because she'd been drinking again, others because she'd simply stopped caring whether she lived or died. She thought about Emma's father, David, who had remarried and started a new family, but who still sent flowers to his daughter's grave every October, still attended the annual memorial service, even though it meant facing the community that had failed to find his daughter's killer. "You ready for this?" Mike asked, his hand on the door handle. Sarah thought about Emma Lawson's parents, who had divorced 2 years after their daughter's death, unable to bear the weight of shared grief. She thought about Rebecca Lawson, who had moved away from Cascade Falls and died in a car accident 5 years later. Some people said because she'd been drinking again, others because she'd simply stopped caring whether she lived or died. She thought about Emma's father, David, who had remarried and started a new family, but who still sent flowers to his daughter's grave every October, still attended the annual memorial service, even though it meant facing the community that had failed to find his daughter's killer. "Yeah, I'm ready." The walk across the street felt longer than it should have, each step carrying the weight of 26 years of questions finally approaching answers. Sarah had arrested murderers before, but never someone she knew. Never someone who had been part of her daily life, woven into the fabric of her community so thoroughly that her absence would leave holes in places no one had thought to protect. Janet Morrison answered the door on the second knock, her silver hair still in curlers, her face free of makeup, but somehow still beautiful in the soft morning light. She wore a blue cotton robe over flannel pajamas, and her feet were bare except for slippers that looked hand-knitted. Probably a gift from one of the many customers who considered her more friend than shopkeeper. "Detectives, this is early, even for you, Sarah. Is everything all right?" The question was the same one she'd asked in the bookstore, and Sarah realized that Janet Morrison had been asking some version of it for 26 years, probably wondering when this moment would come, when the carefully constructed life she'd built on the foundation of a dead child would finally crumble. "Janet Morrison," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest, "you're under arrest for the murder of Emma Lawson." She watched Janet's face for surprise, for denial, for any of the reactions she'd seen from innocent people wrongly accused. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like relief, as if a weight that had been carried for decades was finally being lifted from shoulders too tired to bear it anymore. "Suppose you'd better come in," Janet said, stepping back from the door. "I'll need a few minutes to get dressed, unless you'd prefer to take me as I am." The casual acceptance was more unnerving than tears or protestations would have been. Sarah followed Janet into the house, noting the details that would later become evidence. The neat living room with its overstuffed chairs and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the smell of coffee and cinnamon, framed photographs of community events where Janet smiled alongside people who trusted her, people who'd grieved with her, people who'd never suspected that their comforter was their betrayer.
"The coffee's fresh if you'd like some," Janet said, moving toward the kitchen with the same unhurried grace she brought to arranging books and helping customers. "I always make too much. Force of habit, I suppose. I kept thinking David might come back someday, might need the extra cup." Sarah's breath caught. David Lawson, Emma's father. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Janet Morrison had been in love with a married man, had perhaps seen Emma not as an innocent child, but as an obstacle to the life she wanted, the family she believed should be hers. "Janet," Mike said, his voice gentle but firm. "You need to understand your rights before we continue this conversation." "Of course," Janet replied, but she was looking directly at Sarah when she spoke. "Though I imagine you'd like to know why, wouldn't you? After all these years of wondering, all those late nights going through the files, all those conversations we had about justice and truth, you'd like to understand how someone you trusted could do something so unforgivable." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah realized that this moment had been building for years, that every friendly interaction, every book recommendation, every casual conversation about the weather or the latest town gossip had been part of a larger performance, a carefully orchestrated deception that had fooled an entire community. "Yes," Sarah said simply, "I would." Janet nodded, as if Sarah had confirmed something she'd long suspected. "Then sit down, Detective Chen. Both of you, because this story is longer and more complicated than you know, and if I'm finally going to tell it, I want to tell it properly." The confession began in Janet's kitchen, over coffee that tasted of normalcy and secrets, in a house that had held its silence for 26 years while a community slowly tore itself apart with suspicion and grief. Sarah sat across from a woman she had known for nearly a decade, watching familiar hands pour cream into delicate china cups, the same hands that had helped her find books on criminal psychology, that had rung up her purchases with friendly efficiency, that had killed a child and then spent decades comforting that child's community. "I need to tell you about David first," Janet said, settling into her chair with the careful movements of someone who understood that every word from this moment forward would be weighed and measured and remembered. "Because without understanding that, you'll never understand Emma." Sarah had read David Lawson's statements dozens of times, had interviewed him herself when she took over the case, but she had never thought to look at the relationship through Janet Morrison's eyes. David was 34 when Emma died, a quiet man who worked as an accountant for the county and coached Little League on weekends. His marriage to Rebecca seemed solid to outside observers, built on shared interests and small-town values, but Janet's version of their relationship was different, painted in the darker hues of a woman who had convinced herself she was saving a man from his own unhappiness. "He used to come into the store in the evenings," Janet continued, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup with the same gentle precision she had used to turn the pages of countless books. "Rebecca worked late shifts at the hospital, and Emma was usually at her grandmother's house. David said he needed the quiet, needed somewhere he could think without the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on him." The picture Janet painted was seductive in its simplicity. A lonely man seeking refuge in a bookstore, finding comfort in conversations with a sympathetic woman who understood his need for solitude, who could discuss literature and philosophy without demanding emotional intimacy in return. "I never meant for it to go as far as it did," Janet said, and for the first time I heard something that might have been genuine regret in her voice. "We kissed exactly once, on a Thursday evening in October. Emma had been in the store earlier that day, picking out a book for a school report, and she saw us. She was hiding behind the children's section, probably playing some game, and she saw her father kiss another woman." The October evening Janet described had been 3 days before Emma disappeared. Sarah felt the pieces of the timeline shifting again, puzzle pieces that had never quite fit suddenly clicking into place with the sickening certainty of truth finally revealed. Emma Lawson hadn't wandered off or been taken by a stranger passing through town. She had been killed by someone who saw her as a threat to a future that existed only in a delusional woman's imagination. "She threatened to tell," Janet continued, her voice growing smaller, more defensive. "She said she would tell her mother what she had seen, said her father belonged with their family, not with the book lady. She was 8 years old, Sarah. 8 years old, and she understood exactly what would happen if she told her mother that she had seen her father kissing another woman." Mike leaned forward in his chair, his detective instincts engaged despite the surreal domesticity of the scene. "So you decided to silence her?" "I decided to talk to her," Janet corrected, but there was a brittle quality to her voice now.
the sound of someone who had spent decades perfecting a justification that had never quite convinced even herself. I asked her to meet me after lunch, told her I had something special to show her, something that would help her understand that adults sometimes had complicated relationships, but that didn't mean anyone loved her any less. The manipulation was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Emma Lawson, trusting and curious like most 8-year-olds, had agreed to meet with a woman she knew as the friendly bookstore owner, someone her mother trusted, someone who read stories to children and organized community events. She had walked into the woods behind the elementary school expecting to be shown something wonderful, and instead had encountered an adult whose desperation had curdled into something monstrous. "She was so small," Janet whispered, and Sarah realized with horror that she was speaking about the murder with something that sounded almost like nostalgia. Even for 8, she was tiny. Her mother always worried that she wasn't eating enough, wasn't growing fast enough. Rebecca used to bring her into the store and buy her picture books about brave princesses and strong girls, trying to build up her confidence. The irony was suffocating. Rebecca Lawson had been trying to teach her daughter to be brave and strong, never knowing that those very qualities would seal Emma's fate when she stood up to an adult who was threatening her family's stability. "What happened in the woods, Janet?" Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know, didn't want to carry the images that would inevitably form in her mind once the details were spoken aloud. Janet's composure cracked for the first time since they had arrived at her house. Her hand shook as she set down her coffee cup, and Sarah could see tears beginning to form in the corners of her eyes, though whether they were for Emma or for herself was impossible to determine. "She wouldn't listen," Janet said, her voice breaking. "I tried to explain that her father was unhappy, that sometimes grown-ups needed different kinds of love, that families could take many forms. But she just kept saying, 'You're not my mommy, you're not my mommy,' over and over again, getting louder and more upset. I was afraid someone would hear her, afraid they would find us there together and ask questions I wasn't ready to answer." Sarah felt sick. The image forming in her mind was of a frightened child, alone in the woods with an adult whose behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, trying to defend her family in the only way she knew how, with the simple truth that Janet Morrison was not part of their family and had no right to interfere with it. "So you killed her to keep her quiet?" Mike said, his voice flat with disgust. "I put my hands on her shoulders to try to calm her down. She was so worked up, so scared. I just wanted her to stop crying, to listen to what I was trying to tell her about love and complexity and the way adults sometimes had difficult choices. But she started fighting me, hitting me and scratching, and I pressed too hard. I held on too tight." The euphemisms were almost worse than explicit description would have been. Janet Morrison had strangled an 8-year-old child with her bare hands, had watched the life drain from Emma Lawson's eyes while telling herself that she was simply trying to calm a hysterical child. The self-deception required for such a narrative was staggering, but Sarah had seen it before in other cases, the way murderers rewrote their own actions to make them bearable, to allow themselves to continue living with what they had done.
"And then you came back to town," Sarah said, the full scope of the betrayal finally becoming clear. "You helped organize the search parties. You comforted Emma's parents. You attended her funeral." "I loved that little girl," Janet said, and Sarah saw with horror that she genuinely believed it. "I had watched her grow up, had sold her hundreds of books, had seen her excitement when she discovered a new series or a new author. I would never have heard her if she had just listened. If she had just understood that I wasn't trying to take her father away from her, just share him." The twisted logic was nauseating. Janet Morrison had convinced herself that she loved Emma Lawson, even as she murdered her, had rewritten the narrative of that October afternoon so thoroughly that she could attend the child's funeral without seeing the contradiction in her own actions. "You helped us investigate," Mike said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You gave us information about Emma's reading habits, helped us understand her personality. You knew we were looking for a stranger, someone passing through town, and you let us waste years chasing ghosts." Janet's response revealed the true depth of her narcissism. "I wanted Emma's killer to be caught," she said earnestly, as if she were speaking about someone else entirely. "I wanted justice for that little girl. The person who killed her wasn't me. Not really. It was someone desperate and frightened and trapped in an impossible situation. I spent 26 years trying to atone for what that person did." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the kitchen floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the house. The need to get away from Janet Morrison's voice, from her self-serving justifications and her perverse claim to love the child she had murdered, was overwhelming. But she was a detective, and there were still questions that needed answers, still pieces of the puzzle that required examination. "The DNA under Emma's fingernails. She fought you." "She was brave," Janet agreed, and Sarah heard pride in her voice, as if she were discussing a character in one of her beloved books, rather than a real child who had died trying to defend herself. "She scratched my face, my hands, drew blood. I told people later that my cat had gotten spooked and clawed me. Everyone believed it because cats do that sometimes, and I'd always been careful to be seen as someone who would never hurt anything." The calculated nature of the deception was breathtaking. Janet Morrison had come back to town with visible scratches on her face and hands, evidence of her struggle with Emma Lawson, and had successfully convinced an entire community that a pet had caused the injuries. She had even used the scratches to garner sympathy, accepting concerned comments from neighbors and customers about the dangers of keeping cats as indoor pets. "You kept the bookstore?" Sarah said, thinking about all the time she had browsed those shelves, all the conversations she had shared with the woman who was now revealing herself to be a monster hiding behind a carefully constructed facade of gentleness and community service. "The store was my sanctuary," Janet replied, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that suggested she was retreating into memories that had sustained her through decades of deception. "After David moved away and remarried, after Rebecca died, after the investigation went cold, the store was the only place where I could still feel connected to the person I had been before everything went wrong. Children still came for story time, parents still sought my recommendations, travelers still stopped by looking for something to read on long drives. I could pretend for hours at a time that I was still just the helpful woman who loved books and cared about her community." The community Janet Morrison claimed to love had spent 26 years living with the fear that Emma's killer might still be among them, might be watching their own children, might be waiting for another opportunity to strike. Parents had changed their routines, implemented new safety protocols, struggled with the knowledge that someone in their midst was capable of murdering a child. And all the while, the person responsible had been selling them books and organizing charity drives and positioning herself as a guardian of community values. "You never felt guilty?" Mike asked, and he could hear the disbelief in his voice.
Janet considered the question with the same thoughtfulness she had always brought to discussions of literature and philosophy. "Guilt suggests that you believe you had a choice," she said finally. "I was trapped by circumstances beyond my control, forced into a situation where every possible action would cause pain to someone I cared about. Emma's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't a crime in the way you understand crime. It was the inevitable result of impossible choices and emotional complexities that an 8-year-old mind couldn't comprehend." Sarah felt her hands clenching into fists and forced herself to relax them. The interview was being recorded, and she couldn't afford to let her personal revulsion interfere with the collection of evidence. But listening to Janet Morrison rationalize the murder of a child while sitting in a kitchen decorated with cheerful yellow curtains and ceramic roosters was testing the limits of her professional composure. "We'll need you to come with us now," she said, interrupting Janet's philosophical musings about choice and fate and the tragic inevitability of Emma's death. "Of course," Janet replied, rising from her chair with the same unhurried grace she had shown throughout the morning. "I'll need to call someone to look after the store, arrange for the book club meeting to be postponed. Thursday is story time, and the children will be disappointed if I'm not there to read to them." The casual mention of story time, of Janet Morrison continuing to interact with children even after confessing to murdering one, sent ice through Sarah's veins. "You won't be reading to children anymore," she said, her voice harder than she had intended. Janet paused in the doorway between her kitchen and living room, turning back to look at Sarah with an expression that seemed genuinely puzzled. "But they depend on me," she said. "Who will recommend books to Mrs. Patterson for her classroom library? Who will help the teenagers find something interesting to read during summer vacation? The store is more than just a business, Sarah. It's a community institution. People need what I provide." The breathtaking arrogance of the statement left both detectives momentarily speechless. Janet Morrison had murdered a child and spent 26 years deceiving everyone who trusted her, but she still saw herself as indispensable to the community she had betrayed, still believed that her services as a bookseller somehow outweighed her crime as a killer. As they waited for Janet to dress and gather her things, Sarah walked through the house she had admired from the street during her evening runs, seeing it now with the eyes of someone who understood what secrets it had held. The bookshelves that lined every wall contained volumes on psychology and child development, true crime stories and mysteries, works of philosophy that explored the nature of love and obsession and moral responsibility. Janet Morrison had surrounded herself with stories of human complexity while living her own story of unforgivable simplicity. She had wanted something she couldn't have, and she had killed to protect her delusion that she could have it anyway. The bedroom where Janet dressed contained photographs of community events spanning decades, images of Janet smiling alongside people who had never suspected her true nature. There were pictures from charity fundraisers, book club meetings, holiday celebrations, memorial services, including one from Emma Lawson's funeral, where Janet stood in the background wearing a black dress and an expression of appropriate grief, her face still bearing the faint marks of the scratches Emma had inflicted during her final, futile struggle for life. The Cascade Falls Police Department had never held a press conference for a murder case. Chief Morrison, whose shared surname with the accused would fuel conspiracy theories for months to come, stood behind the podium in the town hall, his weathered face grave as he faced a room packed with residents, reporters, and the curious from neighboring communities who had driven over when news of the arrest began to spread through social media and regional news outlets. Sarah sat in the front row, still processing the surreal events of the morning. 3 hours earlier, she had been sharing coffee with a woman she considered a community pillar. Now that same woman sat in a holding cell, having waived her right to an attorney and continuing to provide details about Emma Lawson's murder with the same methodical precision she had once used to organize inventory in her bookstore. At approximately 6:30 this morning, members of the Cascade Falls Police Department arrested Janet Morrison, age 68, in connection with the 1998 murder of Emma Rose Lawson, Chief Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room.
The reaction was immediate and visceral. Sarah heard gasps, sobs, angry murmurs, and at least one person shouting, "That's impossible!" from somewhere near the back of the room. She turned to scan the crowd, recognizing faces she had known her entire life, people who had trusted Janet Morrison with their children, their secrets, their grief. Mrs. Patterson sat 3 rows back, her face pale with shock. Emma's former teacher had aged considerably in the 26 years since her student's death. Her brown hair now streaked with silver, her once bright eyes dulled by the weight of questions that had never found answers. Sarah remembered interviewing her years ago, how Mrs. Patterson had described Emma as a bright, curious child who loved stories about brave princesses and talking animals. "I don't understand," Mrs. Patterson whispered to the woman beside her, her voice carrying despite the chaos in the room. "Janet helped us search for Emma. She organized the vigil. She donated books to the memorial library in Emma's name." The woman beside her was Margaret Chen, Sarah's own mother, who had served on the school board during Emma's time at Riverside Elementary and had worked closely with Janet on numerous fundraising committees over the years. Margaret's face showed the particular kind of betrayal that came from discovering that someone you had trusted with significant responsibility had been living a lie. She read to children every Thursday, Margaret said, her voice hollow with disbelief. My granddaughter Lucy loved story time at the bookstore. Janet always remembered which books each child preferred, always had recommendations tailored to their reading level and interests. Sarah felt sick thinking about Lucy, her 7-year-old niece who had indeed loved Janet's story times, who had often asked Sarah to take her to the bookstore on weekends so she could browse the children's section and chat with the woman who seemed to understand exactly what kind of adventure each young reader was seeking. From across the room, she spotted David Lawson. Emma's father had aged into a distinguished-looking man of 60, his dark hair now completely silver, his face lined with the kind of weariness that came from carrying grief for decades. He sat alone, apart from his current wife and teenage stepchildren, his eyes fixed on Chief Morrison with the intensity that suggested he was trying to process information that didn't align with his memories of the investigation. Sarah knew from the case files that David had been interviewed extensively in the weeks following Emma's disappearance. He had provided alibis, submitted to polygraph tests, allowed police to search his home and office, cooperated fully with every aspect of the investigation while struggling to hold his marriage together and maintain some semblance of normal life for the sake of his surviving family. The detectives at the time had noted his cooperation and had eventually eliminated him as a suspect, but Sarah now understood the terrible irony. David Lawson had been innocent of his daughter's murder, but his relationship with Janet Morrison had been the catalyst for her death. Chief Morrison continued with the basic facts of the case, explaining the DNA match and Janet's confession while carefully avoiding the more disturbing details of her motivation. But Sarah could see that some people in the crowd were beginning to make connections, were remembering Janet's close relationship with various community members, her unusual level of involvement in the investigation, her seemingly inexhaustible energy for organizing memorial events and support activities. Tom Bradley, who owned the hardware store next to Morrison's books, stood up in the middle of the chief's presentation, his face flushed with anger and confusion. "This is crazy talk," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived in Cascade Falls his entire life and believed he understood its people and their capabilities. Janet Morrison couldn't hurt a fly. Hell, she wouldn't even let me set mouse traps in her store. Said we needed to find humane ways to deal with pest problems. His statement triggered a wave of agreement from other community members who had similar memories of Janet's apparent gentleness and compassion. Sarah heard voices calling out examples of Janet's kindness, how she had delivered books to elderly shut-ins, how she had stayed late to help struggling students with reading assignments, how she had organized a fund to help the Hendricks family when their house burnt down 3 years ago. But other voices began to emerge as well, people who had noticed things they hadn't understood at the time, details that took on new significance in light of Janet's confession. Maria Santos, who worked as a nurse at the elementary school, raised her hand and waited to be recognized.
"I remember Janet being at the school a lot that October," Maria said, her voice shaky but determined. "She was supposedly helping with the reading program, but I saw her in the hallways during recess sometimes, just watching the children play. I thought it was sweet at the time, how much she cared about the kids' development, but now the implication hung in the air like smoke. Janet Morrison hadn't just been a concerned community member, she had been conducting surveillance, learning the routines and habits of potential victims, positioning herself to appear helpful and trustworthy while gathering information that would later prove crucial to her ability to lure Emma away from safety. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the school psychologist who had counseled students and staff in the aftermath of Emma's disappearance, stood up slowly, her professional composure cracking as she spoke. "She volunteered to help with the trauma counseling," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Janet said she understood children's emotional needs because she worked with them at the bookstore, because she had studied child development in college. I let her sit in on group sessions, let her help comfort children who were having nightmares about what might have happened to Emma." The revelation sent a new wave of horror through the crowd. Janet Morrison hadn't just killed Emma Lawson, she had positioned herself as a healer for the trauma her crime had caused, had gained access to the most vulnerable children in the community at the moment when they were most in need of protection and care. Sarah thought about the psychological profiles she had studied during her training, the patterns of behavior common to certain types of killers. Janet Morrison fit the profile of someone who derived satisfaction not just from committing crimes, but from inserting herself into the investigation and aftermath, feeding off the attention and trust of people who saw her as a helper rather than a perpetrator. "She knew details about the investigation," Detective Rodriguez said quietly, leaning over to speak in Sarah's ear. "Things we never released to the public. I always assumed she picked them up from community gossip or her connections to various officials, but now I'm wondering if she was getting information directly from the source." Sarah nodded, remembering her own casual conversations with Janet over the years, times when she had vented about frustrating aspects of the case or shared theories about what might have happened to Emma. She had trusted Janet enough to reveal details that should have remained confidential, had seen their discussions as part of the normal community process of working through shared trauma. The press conference continued, with Chief Morrison outlining the next steps in the legal process. But Sarah's attention was drawn to the reactions of individual community members as they grappled with the revelation that someone they had trusted for decades had been living among them as a murderer. Some people seemed angry, their faces flushed with the indignation of those who felt personally betrayed. Others appeared stunned, their expressions blank with the kind of shock that prevented immediate emotional processing. Still others looked frightened, as if they were suddenly questioning every relationship in their lives, wondering what other secrets might be hidden behind familiar faces. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, the town librarian, stood up with shaking hands to address the chief directly. "What about the children?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "How many children has Janet Morrison been alone with over the years? How do we know Emma wasn't the only one?" The question sent a chill through the room. Sarah realized with growing horror that the investigation was far from over, that Janet's confession to Emma's murder might just be the beginning of a much larger and more complex case. They would need to examine every interaction Janet had ever had with children, would need to interview decades worth of students, parents, and community members to determine whether other crimes had been committed. Chief Morrison acknowledged the concern and promised a thorough investigation, but Sarah could see the fear in parents' faces as they contemplated the possibility that their own children might have been at risk, that they had unknowingly placed their most precious possessions in the care of someone capable of the ultimate betrayal. As the press conference concluded and people began filing out of the town hall, Sarah found herself face to face with David Lawson for the first time since taking over Emma's case. He looked older up close, more fragile, as if the revelation of Janet's guilt had reopened wounds that had never properly healed.
"Detective Chen," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I need to know, was it my fault? Did my relationship with Janet somehow cause this to happen?" Sarah had been dreading this conversation, knowing that David would inevitably blame himself for his daughter's death once he learned about Janet's twisted motivation. The truth was complicated. Janet Morrison alone bore responsibility for her decision to murder Emma, but David's emotional involvement with her had certainly provided the context that made Emma seem like a threat worth eliminating. "Mr. Lawson," Sarah said carefully, "Janet Morrison made a choice to harm your daughter. That choice was hers alone, and the responsibility for Emma's death lies entirely with the person who committed the crime." But David's eyes held a different truth. The understanding of a father who would spend the rest of his life wondering whether different choices might have saved his daughter's life. "She knew," he said quietly. "Janet knew how much I loved Emma, how important she was to me, and she killed her anyway." The simple statement contained multitudes of pain and betrayal. Janet Morrison had claimed to love David Lawson,
had convinced herself that she was fighting for their relationship, but her actions revealed the narcissistic core of her obsession. She had valued her own desires over the life of the person David loved most in the world. "There will be a trial," Sarah told him, though she suspected Janet's confession would make the legal proceedings relatively straightforward. "You'll have a chance to speak, to tell the court about Emma and what her loss has meant to your family." David nodded, but his attention seemed to drift toward the crowd of people still gathered in small groups throughout the town hall, their voices creating a buzz of shock and speculation that would define community conversations for months to come. 26 years, he said. 26 years of wondering, of suspecting everyone and trusting no one. And all that time, she was right there, pretending to care, pretending to help. As David walked away, Sarah realized that the true scope of Janet Morrison's crime was only beginning to become clear. She hadn't just killed one child. She had stolen the innocence of an entire community, had poisoned the trust that allowed neighbors to care for each other's children and feel safe in their shared spaces. The social fabric of Cascade Falls had been torn in ways that might never fully heal, damaged by decades of deception perpetrated by someone who had positioned herself as a guardian of community values. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to the police station, community members who wanted to share their memories of Janet Morrison, their observations about her behavior, their concerns about their own interactions with her over the years. Sarah and Detective Rodriguez interviewed dozens of people, slowly building a picture of Janet's life that was far more complex and disturbing than anyone had imagined. Rebecca Williams, now in her 30s, was 9 years old when Emma disappeared. She remembered Janet reading stories at the library, how Janet had seemed especially interested in the children who came alone, who didn't have parents hovering nearby to monitor their interactions with adults. "She always remembered our names," Rebecca told Sarah, her voice thoughtful as she revisited childhood memories with adult understanding. Even kids who only came to story time once or twice, she would remember their names and what kinds of books they liked. At the time, I thought she was just really good with children. But now I'm wondering if there was something else going on, if she was studying us for reasons we couldn't understand. The interview notes filled several binders by the end of the day, creating a comprehensive picture of a predator who had used her position in the community to gain access to children while maintaining a reputation for gentleness and care. Janet Morrison had been extraordinarily skilled at reading people, at understanding what they needed to hear in order to trust her, at positioning herself as indispensable to the very people she was most likely to harm. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The trial of Janet Morrison began on a Monday morning in March, 6 months after her arrest, in the Cascade County Courthouse 20 miles from the town that had shaped and been shaped by her deception. Sarah sat in the gallery, watching as Emma's killer was led into the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, her silver hair now shorter and somehow less elegant than it had been during her years as the beloved bookstore owner.
The prosecution's case was straightforward. DNA evidence, Janet's detailed confession, and 26 years of circumstantial evidence that suddenly made sense when viewed through the lens of her guilt. The defense attorney, a young public defender named Marcus Webb, had argued for an insanity plea, suggesting that Janet's obsession with David Lawson had created a temporary psychotic break that diminished her responsibility for her actions. But Janet herself had refused to cooperate with the insanity defense. During her testimony, she appeared calm and articulate, describing the events of October 1998 with the same methodical precision she had once used to catalog books. She spoke about Emma as if the child had been a character in a novel, someone whose death was tragic but ultimately necessary for the resolution of a larger story. Emma was a lovely little girl, Janet told the court. her voice carrying the same gentle tone that had once soothed frightened children and grieving parents. She was intelligent and curious and brave, but she was also 8 years old, and 8-year-olds don't understand the complexities of adult relationships. She saw her father's happiness as somehow dependent on her mother's exclusion of other people from their family dynamic. I tried to help her understand that love doesn't have to be limited, that families can take many forms, but she wasn't ready for that kind of emotional sophistication. Sarah watched the jury's faces during Janet's testimony, saw their revulsion at her continued refusal to take full responsibility for her crime. Several jurors appeared visibly disturbed by Janet's clinical description of murdering a child, her apparent inability to understand that no justification existed for her actions. David Lawson testified on the third day of the trial, his voice breaking as he described his relationship with Emma and the guilt he had carried since learning about Janet's motivation. He had aged noticeably in the months since Janet's arrest, his hair whiter, his face more lined, as if the revelation of the truth had somehow been more difficult to bear than 26 years of uncertainty. Emma was the best part of my life, he told the court. She was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked and why people behaved the way they did. She would have grown up to be someone special, someone who made the world better just by being in it. He paused, struggling to control his emotions before continuing. Janet Morrison stole that from the world. She didn't just kill my daughter. She killed all the good Emma would have done, all the lives she would have touched, all the children she might have had, and the grandchildren I'll never know. That's what murder really means. It's not just ending one life, it's ending all the lives that would have grown from that life. The impact statement from the community came in the form of a video presentation created by the current mayor, featuring interviews with dozens of residents who had been affected by Emma's death and Janet's subsequent deception. Teachers spoke about the changes in school security protocols, the way Emma's murder had altered their relationships with students and parents. Parents described the fear that had shadowed their children's lives, the way they had restricted activities and implemented safety measures that transformed the experience of growing up in a small town. Mrs. Patterson, now retired but still living in Cascade Falls, appeared on the video to discuss the lasting impact on the educational community. "We lost our innocence that October," she said, her voice steady but sad. "Before Emma's death, we believed that our children were safe in their own community, that the people who worked with kids were there because they genuinely cared about child welfare. After Emma died, we had to start seeing potential threats everywhere, had to question the motives of people who volunteered to work with children." The video also included segments about the positive changes that had emerged from the tragedy: improved communication between law enforcement and schools, better training for volunteers who worked with children, enhanced support services for families dealing with trauma. But these improvements had come at a tremendous cost, purchased with a child's life and decades of community suffering. Dr. Harper, the school psychologist, provided expert testimony about the long-term effects of Janet's involvement in the trauma counseling following Emma's death. The children who participated in those group sessions have carried additional psychological burdens for 26 years, she explained to the court. They trusted Janet Morrison during one of the most vulnerable periods of their lives, and that trust was violated in the most fundamental way possible. Some of them are now parents themselves, and they're dealing with their own fears about who they can trust with their children's safety.
The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering. Judge Patricia Hendricks, who had signed the original arrest warrant, sentenced Janet Morrison to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but not before delivering a statement that captured the community's sense of betrayal and loss. "Janet Morrison," Judge Hendricks said, her voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench, "you have been convicted of one of the most heinous crimes this community has ever witnessed. But your crime extends far beyond the murder of Emma Lawson, terrible as that was. You spent 26 years lying to people who trusted you, inserting yourself into their grief, and using their pain to feed your own narcissistic need for attention and control. The judge paused, looking directly at Janet with an expression of controlled disgust. You had countless opportunities to confess, to allow Emma's family and community to begin healing from their loss. Instead, you chose to deepen their pain by becoming part of their support system, by positioning yourself as someone who cared about justice and truth while knowing that you were the very person they were seeking. As Janet was led from the courtroom, Sarah felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had finally been served, but it had come too late to heal the deepest wounds inflicted by the crime. Emma Lawson would still be dead. Her parents would still carry the scars of their loss, and the community would still need to rebuild trust that had been systematically destroyed over nearly 3 decades. The months following Janet's conviction brought a strange kind of peace to Cascade Falls, but it was the peace of exhaustion rather than resolution. The town had spent so much energy wondering about Emma's killer that they hadn't prepared for the emotional aftermath of finally knowing the truth. Some residents found closure in Janet's imprisonment, while others struggled with the realization that someone they had known and trusted had been capable of such deception. Morrison's books remained closed after Janet's arrest, its windows covered with brown paper, its shelves full of inventory that no one quite knew how to handle. The building itself became a kind of monument to betrayal, a physical reminder of how thoroughly Janet had embedded herself in the community's daily life. Various proposals emerged for what to do with the space: turn it into a memorial for Emma, convert it to a community center, or simply tear it down and start over with something that carried no associations with the past. Dr. Harper organized support groups for community members who were struggling with the revelation of Janet's guilt, recognizing that the resolution of the case had created its own form of trauma. People who had trusted Janet with their children, their secrets, their grief, needed help processing the magnitude of her betrayal. "It's normal to feel confused and angry," Dr. Harper explained to one group session that Sarah attended in her official capacity. "You trusted someone who violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible. You're grieving not just for Emma, but for your own innocence, for the version of your community that you believed existed before you learned the truth about Janet Morrison." Sarah found herself changed by the case in ways she was still discovering. Her faith in her ability to read people, to detect deception and uncover truth had been shaken by her failure to see through Janet's performance over so many years. She had shared coffee with a child killer, had sought her advice about books and life, had considered her a friend and trusted community member. The professional impact was significant as well. Sarah received offers to transfer to larger departments, to work on high-profile cases in urban areas where her experience with the Morrison case would be valued. But she chose to stay in Cascade Falls, recognizing that her work there wasn't finished, that the community needed people who understood the complexity of what had happened and were committed to rebuilding what had been broken. 1 year after Janet's conviction, the town held the memorial service for Emma Lawson at the elementary school playground where she had loved to count ladybugs and read books during recess. David Lawson spoke to the gathered crowd, his voice stronger than it had been during the trial, his words carrying the weight of someone who had found a way to transform grief into purpose. "Emma would have been 35 this year," he said, looking out at the faces of people who had shared his community's pain and healing. "She would have been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's friend and colleague and neighbor. We can't bring her back, but we can honor her memory by creating the kind of community she would have wanted to grow up in,
a place where children are truly safe, where trust is earned through consistent action, where people look out for each other without sacrificing their vigilance.
The memorial service included the dedication of a new playground structure, funded by donations from around the region by people who had been moved by Emma's story. The equipment was designed with enhanced safety features and clear sight lines that would make it difficult for anyone to approach children without being observed. It was a practical memorial, one that served the living while honoring the dead. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, watching children play on equipment that existed because of Emma's death, feeling the complex emotions that had become her constant companions since Janet's arrest. The case was closed. Justice had been served, and the community was slowly healing. But the cost of that resolution would echo through generations. Chief Morrison approached her as the memorial service concluded, his expression thoughtful as he watched families gathering their children and heading home. "You thinking about those transfer offers?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "No," Sarah replied, her voice certain despite the uncertainty that still clouded so many aspects of her life. "This is home. These people trusted me to find Emma's killer, and it took me 8 years to do it. I owe them more than that." The chief nodded, understanding the sense of responsibility that kept good detectives anchored to the communities they served. "The Morrison case won't be our last difficult investigation," he said. "Small towns like to think they're immune to serious crime, but people are people everywhere, and people are capable of terrible things under the right circumstances." As Sarah walked home through the familiar streets of Cascade Falls, she reflected on the changes that had occurred in the 2 years since Janet's arrest. The town had implemented new safety protocols, created better support systems for vulnerable residents, and developed more effective ways of screening volunteers who worked with children. But the most significant change was harder to quantify: a loss of innocence that would shape how future generations understood the nature of trust and safety in their community. The house on Elm Street where Janet Morrison had lived was sold 6 months after her conviction to a young family from Portland who had been attracted to Cascade Falls' reputation as a safe, family-friendly community. The new owners had repainted the exterior, updated the garden, and installed a playground in the backyard for their 2 small children. Life was moving forward, claiming the spaces that had been marked by tragedy and transforming them into something new. But Sarah knew that memory was longer than physical change, that the people who had lived through Emma's murder and Janet's deception would carry those experiences with them, regardless of what happened to the buildings and spaces where the drama had unfolded. The true legacy of the case wasn't in the empty bookstore or the memorial playground, but in the changed hearts and minds of people who had learned difficult lessons about the complexity of human nature and the fragility of community trust. 3 years later, Sarah Chen stood in the doorway of what had once been Morrison's Books, watching as volunteers from the Cascade Falls Community Center unpacked boxes of children's books for the grand opening of Emma's Literary Garden, a reading space and tutoring center that had emerged from months of community planning and fundraising. The space had been completely renovated, its walls painted in cheerful colors, its shelves organized by reading level and interest rather than the more sophisticated categorization system Janet Morrison had once used. The transformation was remarkable not just in its physical aspects, but in what it represented: a community's determination to reclaim a space that had been tainted by deception and turn it into something genuinely devoted to children's welfare and education. The name had been chosen by Emma's father, who had become the center's primary benefactor and most dedicated volunteer, spending his retirement years reading to children and helping struggling students discover the joy of books. Detective Chen, the voice belonged to Lucy, Sarah's niece, now 10 years old and one of the center's most enthusiastic regular visitors. "Are you coming to the story time today? Mr. Lawson is reading Charlotte's Web, and he does really good voices for all the characters." Sarah smiled, watching her niece's excitement and marveling at how naturally children adapted to new circumstances, how they could accept changed realities without carrying the weight of complicated history. Lucy had been too young to understand the details of Janet Morrison's crimes, but she had absorbed the community's collective determination to create something positive from something terrible.
"I'll be there," Sarah promised, though she knew her presence would be professional as well as personal. The literary center required police clearances for all volunteers and maintained security protocols that reflected the hard-won wisdom of a community that had learned not to trust without verification. David Lawson emerged from the back room carrying a stack of picture books, his face showing the kind of peace that came from finding purpose in grief. At 63, he had discovered a calling he hadn't known existed, becoming an advocate for child literacy and safety, who spoke at conferences around the Pacific Northwest about the importance of community vigilance without community paranoia. "Sarah," he greeted her warmly, setting down the books to shake her hand. "Thanks for coming today. Emma would have loved this place, don't you think? All these books, all these children discovering stories that will stay with them for the rest of their lives." The comment was typical of David's approach to his daughter's memory, always focused on what she had loved rather than how she had died, always emphasizing the positive impact her story could have on other children's lives. It was a form of healing that had taken years to achieve, but it was genuine, rooted in action rather than just words. Dr. Harper had written about David's transformation in her book about community trauma recovery, describing how some survivors of tragedy could channel their pain into purposeful action that honored their loss while serving the greater good. David had become a case study in resilience, showing how individuals could rebuild their lives around service to others without denying or minimizing their own suffering. The grand opening celebration drew nearly 300 people, including families from neighboring towns who had followed Emma's story through news coverage and wanted to support the center's mission. Sarah recognized many faces from the trial, people who had lived through the revelation of Janet Morrison's guilt and had chosen to participate in the community's healing process rather than retreating into isolation or cynicism. Mrs. Patterson, now 78 and using a walker but still mentally sharp, sat in the front row during the dedication ceremony, her eyes bright with tears as David spoke about Emma's love of learning and her belief that books could transport readers to better worlds. Several of Emma's former classmates, now in their 30s, had returned for the event with their own children, creating connections between past and present that felt both poignant and hopeful. "We gather here today not to forget the tragedy that brought this space into being," David told the crowd, "but to celebrate the joy that Emma found in stories and to ensure that other children have access to that same joy, that same sense of possibility that comes from encountering new ideas and different perspectives through books." The ceremony included the unveiling of a small memorial plaque that had been installed near the center's main entrance. The inscription was simple: "In memory of Emma Rose Lawson, 1989 to 1998, who believed that every book contained an adventure waiting to be discovered. May her love of reading inspire generations of young minds to explore, question, and dream." Sarah found the wording perfect in its simplicity, focusing on Emma's life and interests rather than the circumstances of her death. It was a memorial that could inspire rather than frighten, that could help children understand they were part of a legacy of learning rather than victims of a tragedy they were too young to comprehend. 5 years after Janet Morrison's conviction, Cascade Falls had developed a reputation as a model community for child safety and trauma recovery. Dr. Harper's research had attracted national attention, and the town regularly hosted delegations from other communities dealing with similar cases. The protocols developed in response to Emma's murder had been adapted and implemented in dozens of other small towns, creating a network of communities committed to protecting children without sacrificing the openness and trust that made small-town life appealing.
Sarah had been promoted to detective sergeant, with primary responsibility for training officers throughout the region in the investigation techniques that had finally solved Emma's case. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had become an expert in cold case methodology through her failure to recognize a killer who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. But she had learned to channel that embarrassment into determination to help other investigators avoid similar oversights.
Janet Morrison's case had become a textbook example of this phenomenon, studied in criminal justice programs and law enforcement training academies across the country. But for Sarah, it would always be more than an academic exercise. It was a reminder of the responsibility that came with carrying a badge and the trust of a community that depended on her ability to distinguish between those who served and those who prayed. 10 years after Emma's death was solved, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the police station. Rebecca Morrison, no relation to Janet despite the shared surname, had been Emma's best friend and had grown up carrying survivor's guilt about not being with Emma on the day she disappeared. Now 28 and working as a pediatric nurse in Seattle, Rebecca had returned to Cascade Falls to volunteer at Emma's literary garden and to confront the demons that had shaped her understanding of safety and trust. "I wanted to thank you," Rebecca told Sarah, her voice carrying the weight of decades of unanswered questions. "I know it took a long time to solve Emma's case, but you never gave up. That matters more than you probably realize. Knowing that someone was still fighting for Emma, still trying to find the truth, helped me believe that good people existed even when everything felt hopeless." The conversation reminded Sarah why she had chosen to stay in Cascade Falls, despite numerous opportunities to advance her career in larger departments. The work wasn't just about solving crimes. It was about maintaining faith in justice and goodness in communities that had been tested by evil. Every case she closed, every family she helped, every truth she uncovered was part of a larger mission to prove that light could penetrate even the deepest darkness. 15 years after Janet Morrison's conviction, Emma's literary garden had served more than 5,000 children, providing free tutoring, reading programs, and safe after-school activities that honored Emma's memory while protecting other children from similar fates. David Lawson, now approaching 70, continued to volunteer 3 days a week, his gentle manner and obvious love of literature making him a favorite among young readers who had no knowledge of the personal tragedy that had brought him to his calling. The center had expanded beyond its original mission, offering programs for adult literacy, English as a second language classes for immigrant families, and support groups for parents dealing with anxiety about child safety. It had become a community hub in ways that Morrison's books had never been, transparent in its operations and committed to the kind of openness that made predatory behavior more difficult to conceal. Sarah often walked past the center during her evening patrols, watching through the windows as children discovered the same joy in books that Emma Lawson had experienced during her brief life. The sight never failed to move her, representing both the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of redemption that could emerge from even the most devastating tragedies. On quiet nights, when the mountains surrounding Cascade Falls stood silhouetted against star-filled skies, Sarah sometimes thought about the different paths her life might have taken if Emma's case had remained unsolved. She might have left police work, might have moved away from the community that held so many painful associations, might have chosen a career path that didn't require her to confront the worst aspects of human nature on a regular basis. But she had learned that running from darkness didn't eliminate it. It only left others to face it alone. By staying, by continuing to serve, by helping train other officers to recognize the signs she had missed. She was participating in the slow, difficult work of making the world safer for children like Emma, like her niece Lucy, like all the young readers who gathered at the literary garden to discover that books could indeed contain adventures waiting to be explored. 20 years after Emma Lawson's death, her father published a memoir about grief, healing, and the unexpected ways that tragedy could lead to purpose. The book, titled Reading to Emma, A Father's Journey from Loss to Hope, became a bestseller and established David as a sought-after speaker on topics ranging from victim advocacy to community resilience. He donated all proceeds to literacy programs and child safety organizations, ensuring that Emma's legacy would continue expanding long after he was gone.
In the book's final chapter, David wrote about visiting Janet Morrison in prison on the 10th anniversary of her conviction. The meeting had been difficult but necessary, part of his own healing process and his need to understand how someone could commit such a crime while maintaining the facade of caring about children's welfare. She showed no remorse, David wrote. Even after 10 years in prison, Janet Morrison continued to see herself as the victim of circumstances rather than the perpetrator of an unforgivable crime. She spoke about Emma as if she were a character in a story rather than a real child who had loved and been loved, who had dreams and fears, and the infinite potential that every child carries. The conversation had confirmed what David had suspected. Janet Morrison was incapable of genuine empathy or remorse, locked into a narcissistic worldview that prevented her from acknowledging the full impact of her actions. But paradoxically, this confirmation had brought David peace, allowing him to let go of any lingering hope that Janet might eventually understand what she had taken from the world and express genuine sorrow for her crime. 25 years after Emma's murder, Cascade Falls celebrated the silver anniversary of Emma's literary garden with a community festival that drew visitors from across the Pacific Northwest. The event featured readings by published authors who had been inspired by Emma's story, book drives that collected thousands of volumes for distribution to underserved schools, and panel discussions about the role of literacy in building strong, safe communities. Sarah, now in her early 50s and serving as Cascade Falls police chief, stood at the edge of the festival crowd, watching 3 generations of families participate in activities that honored Emma's memory while celebrating the community's resilience. Her own daughter, Maya, now 15 and a volunteer at the Literary Garden, was helping younger children navigate a treasure hunt that led them through different sections of books, each clue teaching them something new about literature and storytelling. The sight filled Sarah with a complex mixture of pride and melancholy. Maya had grown up in the shadow of Emma's story, her childhood shaped by enhanced safety protocols and her mother's professional commitment to preventing similar tragedies. But rather than making her fearful, the awareness had made Maya more compassionate, more committed to community service, more understanding of the responsibility that came with trust and privilege. "Mom," Maya called out, jogging over with a clipboard full of treasure hunt signatures, "Mrs. Chen from the library wants to know if you'll say something at the closing ceremony. She says it would mean a lot to have you acknowledge how far the community has come." Sarah hesitated. Public speaking had never been her favorite aspect of police work, and the emotions surrounding Emma's case still felt raw, even after so many years. But she understood the symbolic importance of her participation, the way her presence connected the investigation that had finally brought justice to the ongoing work of healing and prevention. "Tell her I'll speak," Sarah said, accepting the weight of responsibility that had defined her career in Cascade Falls. As afternoon moved toward evening, the festival crowd gathered around a temporary stage that had been erected in the town square. David Lawson, now 71 but still vital and engaged, served as master of ceremonies. His comfort in front of crowds reflected decades of advocacy work and public speaking. He had become the unofficial keeper of Emma's memory, ensuring that her story was told with accuracy and dignity while emphasizing hope rather than despair. 27 years ago, David began, his voice carrying clearly through the warm summer air. This community faced its worst nightmare when a child was taken from us. But in the years since then, we've learned that even the darkest tragedy can become the foundation for something beautiful if we have the courage to build on it together.
Sarah listened from the side of the stage, thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The investigation that had consumed 8 years of her career, the revelation that had shattered everything the community thought it knew about trust and safety, the slow process of rebuilding that had required unprecedented cooperation and commitment from hundreds of people. When David introduced her, Sarah approached the microphone with the same steady determination that had carried her through the most difficult moments of Emma's case. The crowd fell silent, their faces reflecting the respect and gratitude of a community that understood how much she had sacrificed to bring them answers. Emma Lawson would be 36 years old today, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. She would have been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's colleague and friend. We can't bring her back, but we can honor her memory by continuing to build the kind of community she deserved to grow up in. A place where children are protected not just by laws and protocols, but by the active care and vigilance of adults who understand that every child's safety is everyone's responsibility. She paused, looking out at the faces of people who had lived through the investigation, the revelation, the trial, and the long process of healing. Some had been Emma's classmates, now parents themselves. Others had been the adults who had searched for her, grieved for her, and eventually learned to transform their pain into purposeful action. The Emma Lawson case taught us that evil can hide behind the most trusted faces, that predators often position themselves as protectors, that our instincts for trust and community can be manipulated by those who would harm our children, Sarah continued. But it also taught us that truth, however delayed, can still bring justice, that communities, however wounded, can still heal, that love, however tested, can still triumph over hatred and deception. The crowd responded with sustained applause, but Sarah wasn't finished. The speech she had prepared in her mind during the drive to the festival had evolved as she spoke, shaped by the faces before her and the weight of everything they had experienced together. "I want to talk about forgiveness," she said, her voice carrying a new intensity that quieted the crowd. "Not forgiveness for Janet Morrison. Her crimes were unforgivable, and she has never shown genuine remorse for what she did. But forgiveness for ourselves, for our own failures to see what was happening in plain sight, for our own part in creating the conditions that allowed a predator to operate in our community for so long." The admission was difficult, but necessary. Sarah had spent years carrying guilt about her friendship with Janet, about the conversations they had shared, about her failure to detect the deception that had fooled an entire town. She had learned that healing required acknowledgement of failure as well as celebration of eventual success. We trusted someone who betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. We invited a killer into our homes, our schools, our hearts. And then, when we finally learned the truth, we had to find a way to continue trusting, to continue building relationships, to continue believing that most people are good, even though we had been so terribly wrong about someone we thought we knew. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of shared memory and mutual understanding. These people had lived through something that challenged the basic assumptions on which community life depended. They had been forced to rebuild their capacity for trust from the ground up, to find ways of protecting their children without succumbing to paranoia or isolation. The Emma Lawson case stands as proof that we chose the right path. We chose to honor Emma's memory by creating something beautiful, something that serves the living while remembering the dead. We chose to let love be stronger than fear, hope stronger than despair, community stronger than the forces that would tear it apart. As Sarah stepped back from the microphone, she felt a sense of completion that had eluded her for decades. The case was closed, justice had been served, and the community had not just survived, but thrived in the aftermath of tragedy. Emma Lawson's legacy lived on not in the circumstances of her death, but in the positive changes her story had inspired.
The festival concluded with a candlelight vigil. Hundreds of small flames flickering in the gathering dusk as people shared memories of Emma and reflections on the journey of healing the community had undertaken. Children who had never known Emma participated alongside adults who remembered her laugh, her curiosity, her love of stories and adventures. Maya stood beside her mother during the vigil, holding a candle that cast dancing shadows on her young face. At 15, she was the same age Emma would have been when she entered high school, and Sarah couldn't help but think about the parallel lives that might have been lived, the friendship that might have developed between her daughter and the girl whose death had shaped both their lives in fundamental ways. "Do you think she would have been proud of what the community built in her memory?" Maya asked, her voice soft in the candlelit darkness. Sarah considered the question seriously, thinking about what she knew of Emma's personality from the interviews and memories she had collected over the years. Emma had been curious, compassionate, determined, qualities that would have made her an advocate for literacy and child safety if she had lived to adulthood. "I think she would have been amazed," Sarah replied, "not just by the literary garden, but by the way people came together to create something positive from something so terrible. Emma believed in the power of stories to change lives. I think she would have loved knowing that her story, as difficult as it is, has helped protect other children and brought people together around the values she cared about." As the vigil ended and families began walking home through the familiar streets of Cascade Falls, Sarah reflected on the transformation the community had undergone. The town was no longer the place it had been in 1998, innocent and trusting in ways that had made it vulnerable to predators. But it wasn't bitter or suspicious either. It had found a balance between vigilance and openness, between protection and freedom, between remembering the past and building toward the future. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the police station to find a letter waiting on her desk, postmarked from the state penitentiary where Janet Morrison was serving her life sentence. She stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it, unsure whether she wanted to read whatever message Janet had decided to send after nearly 15 years of silence. The letter was brief, written in the same neat handwriting that had once recorded book sales and organized reading schedules. "Dear Detective Chen, I heard about the anniversary celebration for the literary garden from another inmate whose sister lives in Cascade Falls. She showed me a newspaper article about the event, including quotes from your speech. I want you to know that I am glad the community has found a way to honor Emma's memory that focuses on positive action rather than dwelling on the tragedy of her death. Emma was a remarkable child, and she deserved better than what happened to her in those woods. I know that my words carry no weight with you or with anyone else in Cascade Falls, but I want to say that I am sorry for the pain my actions caused, not just to Emma and her family, but to the entire community that trusted me. I was sick in ways I didn't understand at the time, consumed by obsessions that distorted my judgment and led me to commit an unforgivable act. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't ask for mercy. I only hope that my imprisonment serves as some small measure of justice for Emma and as a reminder to others that the capacity for evil exists in people who seem trustworthy and caring. The person who killed Emma is gone, destroyed by her own actions and the consequences that followed. What remains is someone who spends every day thinking about a little girl who loved books and should have lived to share that love with children of her own. Sincerely, Janet Morrison. Sarah read the letter twice before filing it with the rest of the case documentation. The words seemed more genuine than anything Janet had said during her confession or trial. But Sarah was no longer interested in parsing the sincerity of the woman who had deceived her community for so long. What mattered was not Janet's belated expression of remorse, but the positive changes her crimes had ultimately inspired. The annual report Sarah submitted to the state police that year noted that Cascade Falls had achieved one of the lowest crime rates in Washington, with particular success in preventing crimes against children. The community's commitment to background checks, volunteer training, and open communication had created an environment where predatory behavior was unlikely to go unnoticed or unreported.
But statistics couldn't capture the full impact of Emma's legacy. Sarah saw it in the confidence of children who attended the literary garden, secure in an environment designed with their safety as the highest priority. She saw it in the adults who had learned to balance trust with verification, who welcomed newcomers while maintaining appropriate boundaries and supervision. She saw it in the teenagers, like Maya, who had grown up understanding that community responsibility was not an abstract concept, but a daily practice that required active participation from everyone. 30 years after Emma's murder, Sarah received a phone call that brought the case full circle in an unexpected way. The caller was Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had conducted the DNA analysis that finally identified Janet Morrison as Emma's killer. Now in her 70s and retired from the state crime lab, Dr. Martinez was working on a book about cold cases that had been solved through advances in forensic science. "I'm writing about the Emma Lawson case," Dr. Martinez explained. "Not just the technical aspects of the DNA analysis, but the broader impact the case had on law enforcement practices and community safety protocols. I'd like to interview you about the investigation and its aftermath, if you're willing." Sarah agreed to the interview, recognizing the educational value of sharing their experience with other law enforcement professionals and communities that might face similar challenges. The conversation, which took place over several sessions, became an opportunity for Sarah to reflect on the full arc of the case and its meaning in her life and career. "The hardest part," Sarah told Dr. Martinez during one of their interviews, "wasn't solving the case or even arresting someone I had considered a friend. It was living with the knowledge that I had been fooled for so long, that I had shared information with the very person I was trying to catch, that I had trusted someone who was using that trust to harm the community I had sworn to protect." Dr. Martinez nodded, understanding the professional and personal implications of such a revelation. "But you didn't let that knowledge paralyze you," she observed. "You used it to become better at your job, to help train other officers, to prevent similar deceptions from succeeding in the future." The observation was true, though Sarah had never thought of her response in such positive terms. The guilt and embarrassment she had felt after Janet's arrest had motivated her to study predatory behavior more intensively, to develop better techniques for recognizing deception, to create training programs that helped other officers avoid the mistakes she had made. Emma Lawson's case changed everything about how we approach investigations involving trusted community members, Sarah explained. "We learned that predators often position themselves as helpers, that they use their reputation for caring about children to deflect suspicion and gain access to potential victims. Now we know to look more carefully at the people who seem most helpful, most concerned, most invested in the investigation." The training program Sarah had developed was eventually adopted by law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest, and elements of it were incorporated into FBI guidelines for investigating crimes against children. Emma's death had contributed to the development of investigative techniques that had helped solve hundreds of other cases, protecting countless children from predators who might otherwise have remained undetected. As Sarah approached retirement after 35 years in law enforcement, she found herself thinking more frequently about legacy. Not just Emma's legacy, but her own.
The case that had defined her career had taught her that justice delayed was not always justice denied, that communities could heal from even the most devastating betrayals, that love could indeed triumph over hatred if people were willing to do the hard work of building something better from the ruins of tragedy. The last entry in the Emma Lawson case file, written on the day Sarah officially retired from the Cascade Falls Police Department, reflected on the journey from investigation to resolution to community healing. Case number 98-2847, Emma Rose Lawson. Final report, Detective Chief Sarah Chen. This case began with the disappearance of an 8-year-old girl and ended with the transformation of an entire community. Over the course of 28 years, the investigation revealed not only the identity of Emma's killer, but also the capacity of human beings to deceive, to heal, and to create meaning from tragedy.
Janet Morrison's conviction brought legal closure to Emma's murder, but the true resolution came through the community's decision to honor Emma's memory by building something positive and lasting in her name. Emma's literary garden has served thousands of children, providing them with safe spaces to learn and grow, while ensuring that Emma's love of reading continues to inspire new generations. The investigation taught us that evil can hide behind trusted faces, but it also demonstrated that good people, working together over time, can overcome even the most devastating betrayals. Emma Lawson died too young, but her legacy lives on in every child who discovers the joy of reading, in every parent who feels secure in their community's commitment to child safety, in every person who chooses to build rather than destroy in the face of tragedy. Case closed, but Emma's story continues. Sarah sealed the file and placed it in the department's permanent archives, knowing that future investigators might study it to understand how communities respond to and recover from crimes that challenge their fundamental assumptions about trust and safety. Emma's case had become part of the institutional memory of law enforcement, a reminder that justice sometimes comes slowly, but that persistence and community commitment could overcome even the most carefully constructed deceptions. On her last day as a police officer, Sarah walked through downtown Cascade Falls, past Emma's literary garden where children were engaged in their afternoon reading programs, past the elementary school where enhanced safety protocols had become part of daily routine, past the Memorial Park, where Emma's name was inscribed among other community members who had died too young, but whose memories continued to inspire positive action. The Tao had changed dramatically in the 3 decades since Emma's death, but it had retained the essential qualities that made small-town life appealing. Neighbors who knew and cared about each other, businesses that served as community gathering places, institutions that prioritized the welfare of children and families. The difference was that trust was now earned rather than assumed, that vigilance was balanced with openness, that the lessons of the past informed decisions about the future without paralyzing the community with fear. Maya, now a college student studying criminal justice with plans to follow in her mother's footsteps, had written her senior thesis on the long-term impact of Emma's case on community policing strategies. Her research documented the measurable improvements in child safety that had resulted from the protocols developed in response to Emma's murder, but it also explored the less tangible benefits: increased civic engagement, stronger social networks, better communication between institutions and families. Emma's story shows that terrible things can lead to positive changes if communities are willing to learn from tragedy rather than simply mourning it, Maya wrote in her thesis conclusion. The literary garden that bears her name is more than a memorial. It's a testament to the possibility of transformation. Proof that love can indeed triumph over hatred if people are willing to do the work of building something better from the ashes of loss. As Sarah read her daughter's thesis, she felt a sense of completion that had eluded her throughout her career. The case that had haunted her for so many years had ultimately become a source of hope rather than despair. Evidence that justice could prevail and communities could heal if good people refused to give up in the face of evil. Emma Lawson was dead for 30 years, but her impact on the world continued to grow, rippling outward through the lives of children who had benefited from improved safety protocols, through law enforcement officers who had learned to recognize predatory behavior more effectively, through communities that had chosen to honor her memory by creating something beautiful and lasting in her name. The little girl who loved books and ladybugs had become a symbol of resilience and hope, proof that even the shortest lives could have profound and lasting impact if their stories were told with truth and honored with action. In death, Emma had achieved a kind of immortality, her legacy living on in every child who felt safe, every parent who felt confident in their community's commitment to protection, every person who chose to build rather than destroy in the face of tragedy. Sarah's retirement was not an ending but a transition, from active investigation to active remembrance, from solving crimes to preventing them through education and community engagement. Emma's case would always be with her, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what was possible when people refused to give up in the face of evil. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.